Ever since U.S. President Donald Trump took office, one word in particular has been echoing around Capitol Hill.
Russia.
Russia.
Allegations of Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election have consumed American politics. Several investigations are underway, looking into the Kremlin's actions and whether Trump's campaign accepted outside help. Relations between Washington and Moscow were already frosty under former U.S. President Barack Obama. The U.S. and EU have repeatedly imposed sanctions against Russia over the conflict in Ukraine. Now, President Trump has signed off on even more sanctions, this time over reported Russian meddling in the last elections. Moscow retaliated, ordering 755 U.S. diplomats to leave the country. Despite the standoff, U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson met Sergei Lavrov on the sidelines of the recent ASEAN summit. There were signs both countries may be prepared to patch things up.
So I don't think it is useful to just cut everything off over one single issue. I think, again, these are two very large countries, and we should find the places that we can work together. Let's try to work together.
Но мы почувствовали готовность наших американских коллег все-таки диалог продолжать. Думаю, что альтернативы этому просто не существует.
The escalating tension with Russia has put Trump in a corner. He's hinted at wanting to improve relations with President Vladimir Putin, who he openly admires.
Yeah, I think we got along very well, and I think that's a good thing. That's not a bad thing.
But can the U.S. and Russia ultimately overcome their differences on major global issues, which have sunk relations to their lowest point since the Cold War? Fighting in Ukraine between government forces and pro-Russian separatists hasn't stopped. And the U.S. and Russia accuse each other of providing military support to opposing forces on the ground. A total breakdown in bilateral relations would sink an already fragile peace deal there. Over in Syria, Washington and Moscow are also at odds over Russia's military backing of Bashar al-Assad. International efforts to stop the war have so far failed. But the two have recently brokered a ceasefire in southwestern Syria.
When two superpowers, Russian Federation, which is an ally of President Assad, and the United States of America agree fundamentally at that level in trying to make that ceasefire work, there is a strong chance that that will take place.
The trouble is, Trump is new in office, while Putin has an election to win next year. That means both men need to make an impression, and they may well return to strong rhetoric and political posturing. Sandra Gatman, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Washington is Jamie Fly. He's a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, as well as a former security advisor to Senator Marco Rubio. In Pittsburgh, we have human rights professor Dan Kovalik. He's the author of The Plot to Scapegoat Russia, How the CIA and the Deep State Have Conspired to Vilify Russia. And in Vienna, Emre Erşin, he's a Russia analyst at Turkey's Marmara University. Gentlemen, good to have you with us. So here's the thing. Trump has been promising closer ties with Russia, with President Putin. Now he's been backed into signing these sanctions, which he or any future president is going to find hard to ignore. Jamie, have US-Russia relations evaporated before our very eyes?
I don't think that there's all that much change, actually. I think for the last several presidential administrations, we've had contentious relations between the United States and Russia. Multiple administrations have tried to improve those relations, to find areas where they can work with the Russian government. But the reality is that Russia continues to pursue policies that run counter to U.S. interests, that threaten our allies. And so I think certainly there's a broad support in the U.S. public and in the U.S. Congress for these sanctions, and I think the Trump administration is going to have its hands tied to a certain extent and be somewhat limited in what they can do.
But it isn't the issue with President Trump that he talked about, personality politics. President Putin is a good guy, someone he can work with. I mean, that's what people were worried about.
Well, he has talked about trying to improve relations with Vladimir Putin. They supposedly got on well together in their first meeting, but the reality is previous presidents have had the same sort of interaction with Russian leaders, and there haven't been positive results. And so I think that's the challenge that President Trump now faces.
Emre, why tie Trump's hands over sanctions? Is this him being sidelined?
Well, I think he's sidelined by the American establishment, and I think this is how Russia perceives the situation. Because when President Trump was elected, they really had high expectations about the future of Russian-American relations, which were at an all-time low during the last few years of the Obama period. So, and we know, for example, that Trump, through his social media account, claimed that he was not very happy about what's going on regarding the relations with Russia. So it seems that it takes more than Trump to fix the relationship between Russia and the United States. And I think this is also why Russia actually decided to go back to its harsh rhetoric about the United States administration and its foreign policy very lately.
Dan, do you agree with that? Did President Putin believe, when Trump came to power, that there would be a thaw in relations?
Well, I think so, because as you indicated, Trump made noises that he wanted friendlier relations with Russia. And I don't see why we can't have those relations. I really disagree with Jamie's assessment that other presidents have tried to have good relations with Russia. In fact, I think they haven't. I think Russia has tried to have good relations with us. Putin was the first world leader to call George W. Bush after 9/11 to offer condolences, to offer help in Afghanistan with operations there after 9/11. He gave that help. He helped Obama with the Iran nuclear deal. He helped rid Syria of chemical weapons. I don't see Russia as a threat to the United States or its interests. I don't think the U.S. has tried to accept the olive branch that Russia has offered. And I do think that Trump has now been painted into a corner, mostly by the Democrats over this Russiagate nonsense, which seems to have little validity there. So yes, I think
nonsense.
Putin thought
Are you talking about the
better.
accusations that Russia meddled in the election? Because obviously that's an accusation that's been taken pretty seriously in Washington.
Yes, and I don't think it is as serious. I agree with John Pilger, one of my favorite journalists, who says there's not even any allegations there. It's just a big smokescreen, I think, to cover the Democrats' butts after losing the election to Trump. And by the way, I'm not a Trump supporter, but I do support the attempt to have détente with Russia. And I think all of this Russiagate is just a distraction from huge issues confronting the United States.
Let's see what Jamie says about that. This idea that this accusations of Russia meddling in the election, this is all just a distraction and a way of torpedoing, better relations between the US and Russia.
Well, the reality, if you look at the last sanctions bill that was passed overwhelmingly in Congress, and it wasn't just passed with Democratic votes, it was passed because Republicans both wrote the original legislation and then endorsed it in both houses. I mean, Republicans control both houses of Congress, so they backed this measure. It wasn't just in response to Russia's meddling in our elections and our politics. It was also in response to Russia's ongoing aggression in Ukraine, its meddling in Syria, and a whole host of issues, its ongoing threats to our allies in Europe. And so, I know some people don't like to believe that Russia has now taken this to the next level and actually trying to insert itself into our politics. But it's a fundamental fact, and it's a reality because of our failed efforts over the last several administrations to try to find these areas of cooperation. At every turn, Putin has ended up exploiting American presidents, and that's the real danger that I think President Trump faces if he continues to deny reality and tries to go back again and again to find these areas of cooperation. Vladimir Putin is not interested in cooperating with the United States.
Okay, let's just remind ourselves of the optimism of just a few weeks ago when President Trump met President Putin at the G20 conference. This is what he had to say.
President Putin and I have been discussing various things, and I think it's going very well. We've had some very, very good talks. We're going to have a talk now, and obviously that will continue. But we look forward to a lot of very positive things happening for Russia, for the United States, and for everybody concerned.
Emre, are there still areas where Russia and the US can still cooperate, even with these sanctions hanging over Russia?
Well, I think we need to be optimistic about the United States-Russian relations because we are actually talking about two permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. So in terms of international law, any kind of resolution would need both of their approval. So I think they're aware of that. And despite all the disagreements in many issues, including Syria, Ukraine, Afghanistan, and etc., they still need each other very desperately in all of these issues at the same time. For example, you just mentioned the meeting between Trump and Putin. One of the things they agreed in that meeting was about the establishment of a de-escalation zone in southwest of Syria. So currently the situation in Syria is very complicated, and both actors are very crucial actors in terms of finding a solution to Syria. And I also believe that is the case for Ukraine. Yes, I know that the sanctions are about Ukraine and Crimea, but I think the United States should also be wise to know that without reaching out to Russia, there is no way to correct the situation in Ukraine, or at least take some meaningful steps regarding Crimea. So in all these geopolitical issues that we're talking about, the United States and Russia needs to have a dialogue at least. I don't know if cooperation, intense cooperation, is possible, but at least a minimum level of dialogue is quite important for solving all these different issues that we talked about.
Dan, do you agree with that? Because clearly Russia is having increasing leverage, certainly in the Middle East, in the areas of Syria, some growing influence over Iraq. Do you think it's going to leave the door open to some kind of dialogue over those issues where maybe the interests of the US and Russia overlap?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think Russia's made it clear over and over that it wants to be a partner of the United States. If you watch the Oliver Stone interview with Putin, he continues to call the United States a partner. I don't think Russia wants an adversarial relationship with the United States. I think the door is open with Russia. And as was indicated, we need Russia as an ally on a number of fronts, and we certainly cannot afford to have Russia, another nuclear power, as an enemy. I think we are
given
moving
that
quite dangerous to...
President Putin's priority, one presumes, when President Trump was elected, was possibly the hope that the sanctions which had been applied from 2014 over Crimea would be relaxed. Instead, he's got a whole new raft of sanctions. So doesn't that, if that's his priority, to try and get rid of sanctions, then that's not going to work for Mr. Putin anymore, is it?
Well, it's true, and I'm certain he wants to get rid of the sanctions, but I don't think that's the only reason he wants a partnership with the United States. Look, Russia's economy is much smaller than the United States. It is a weaker power, certainly after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think Russia needs the United States more than the U.S. needs Russia, and I think, the U.S. has shown that sort of contempt for Russia. I think Russia wants to be part of the West. I think they thought they were going to be admitted to the West after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And frankly, I see the West, I blame the West for failing to admit them, into the community of nations. We now surrounded them with NATO. And, but I think the Russians still want a partnership with the United States, and I think we should accept that.
Okay, Jamie, how much hinges on what the Trump administration will do next in regards to Russia retaliating to sanctions by kicking out hundreds of US diplomatic staff. What do you think the US's next step is going to be?
It's hard to say. I mean, I think the Trump administration has tried to play down this particular spat over diplomatic personnel. So they may feel forced to respond in some way. I don't know at the end of the day that back and forth on diplomatic personnel is really going to have a lasting impact on where U.S.-Russian relations go from here. I think the fact of the matter is the sanctions are now law. The administration is going to have to implement them. There's still a lot of bipartisan concern in Congress about the direction of U.S.-Russia policy. And the fact of the matter is, as the U.S. intelligence community has warned, the Russians are going to attempt to meddle in our politics again in the future. And so I think the bigger question is what does Congress do? What does the administration do to send a clear signal
and where is all this leading?
Because
there are some observers talking about a return to sort of the echoes of the Cold War.
I mean, I think it's a fundamentally different geostrategic situation compared to the Cold War. I think Russia can certainly threaten U.S. interests, but it's doing so in a very selected and targeted way. You don't have the same sort of situation where there's a balance of power on either side and countries aligned with either power. So I think I'm not worried about a new Cold War, but the reality is Vladimir Putin only understands negotiating partners that deal with him from a position of strength. And I think the lesson of the last two administrations is that when you don't deal with him from a position of strength, you end up getting your interest attacked, and eventually he attempts to meddle in your own politics.
Emre, is there...
I just think that's...
Sorry, go on, Dan.
I just think what Jamie's saying is completely made up. I mean, it's not true. As I said, Putin showed in many respects a willingness to work with the U.S. in various areas. You know, last September, he and Obama came to an agreement in Syria, which in that agreement was broken not by Putin. It was broken when the U.S. military bombed Syrian troops outside Damascus, which clearly scuttled that peace agreement. I mean, I don't see Russia as this great bugaboo that you can't work with. You can work with them, and they have worked with us. This idea that somehow it's the U.S. that has tried to work with Russia and that Russia hasn't worked with us, it's just complete nonsense. And frankly, what's happening in the Ukraine cannot be laid all at Putin's feet. The U.S. has been meddling in the Ukraine for years. The U.S. helped bring about the coup in 2014. The U.S. has been working with neo-Nazis in the Ukraine. I just think people have to get real about the U.S.'s own role vis-a-vis Russia.
So, Jamie, it's not about Russia not wanting to work with the U.S., it's the U.S. not wanting to work with Russia.
Well, the facts are that the Bush administration tried to finalize arms control agreements with Vladimir Putin's government. What they got at the end of the Bush administration was Russian invasion of Georgia. The Obama administration did the infamous reset with Russia. We were told there was a new type of Russian leader, Medvedev. He's now been once again relegated to a lower role. Putin is back. And the Obama administration ended up with Ukraine getting invaded, Russia reasserting itself in Syria in a new way. I mean, all you have to do is ask any of your viewers in Turkey, is Syria more stable now that Russia has been meddling in it for the last several years?
Well,
or was
to be
it
fair,
more stable prior to Russia getting involved?
Russia did manage to broker de-escalation zones in Syria, which is more than the US ever did.
The U.S. was involved in all of those. The UN was involved. We have new de-escalation zones. They don't end up holding. The reality is Russia is emboldening Assad. They're enabling the slaughter of the Syrian people. They're empowering Iran. That's not a more stable Syria in the long run for the region and all of Syria's neighbors. That's not a Syria in the long run that's in the U.S. interest.
Okay, Emre, let me bring you into this because I said earlier, you know, are we seeing an echo of the Cold War? And nobody wants to over-egg that pudding, but we are seeing U.S. forces taking part in exercises recently across Eastern Europe. Russia building forces against its border with Europe. So, you know, where is all this leading?
Well, I mean, it might be a little misleading to call it a Cold War, because I agree with the other speaker that the balance of power between the United States and Russia is not like the Cold War anymore. I mean, Russia has significant economic problems, we know that, and militarily speaking even, Russia is not able to compete with the United States or even China. So I think what Russia is trying to do is to use its strengths and especially its political influence in most of these regions that we talked about, East Europe and Middle East especially. And these are, especially when we speak about the Middle East, this is a region where the United States deliberately wanted to withdraw its forces away from during the Obama period. So whenever the United States is absent from a region, Russia uses its political influence and military influence, of course, in those regions in order to counter the United States power there. But this is not a Cold War, actually. And I would also like to say that Putin knows that he needs the United States. Yes, there are many disagreements, but on the other hand, we also talked about the areas of cooperation and other areas of geopolitical interests common to both of the countries, especially with Syria. And so I think it might be a little unfair to call it a Cold War. And we are actually beyond the Cold War. And I think this would be the way we should all be thinking in order to prevent another direct clash between Russia and the United States. Nobody would want that, including Turkey, of course.
Okay, and Dan, quick last word to you. Where do you think Moscow is now looking to try, and I mean, will it try and keep relations, channels of cooperation open with the US? What's going to happen next?
I do believe they will. I think they will still want to work with the United States in Syria. We'll try to work with the U.S. for some resolution of the conflict in Ukraine. I think, you know, there is still hope for good relations, but I do agree that these sanctions have made it much more difficult, and I do worry that, in fact, we may be in the middle of a Cold War at this point, which I think none of us should welcome.
Okay, well, gentlemen, a great discussion. I think we're all agreed that it would be better if US and Russia could work together in future. Thank you very much indeed for joining me. Jamie Fly, Dan Kowalik and Emre Erşen.